So you were saying, Matt?
On the note of the conception versus the relationship, yeah, I see that too. I especially see it in the next few paragraphs. And in the next few paragraphs, I hear a lot of an assumption of Platonism that the writer is going to argue against. So when he talks about, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, the relation relating to itself or to a third term, and that third term, what is it? There's this phrase that people use against the argument that Plato made, that there are you, I, and Robert, I, and Julian, but in fact, the three of us aren't really real. What's really real is the idea of us. Why? Because we somehow relate to that idea as something we're aspiring to, like you had said with the ideal selves that we're maybe through this conversation and through whatever practice we use to become more spiritual, or however you want to phrase it, we try to get to. But it's called the third man problem in Plato. Yeah, but if there's a relation between you and an idea, how do you understand that relation? Well, there has to be a third term that allows you to understand the relation between you and the idea. So that's a third idea, which means there's another, and it becomes an infinite series of lines of how you understand your relation to anything at all. Like saying, I can understand you right now because there's a tablet here mediating us. So I have to understand in some sense what a tablet is before I can talk to you and reach you. But that assumes all this other stuff I have to relate myself to and understand. So you can never get to the idea, is the argument against Plato's ideas. And I hear Kirkegaard kind of doing that. So if you relate to yourself, you do it by a third thing. But he's trying to say, but there's not a third man problem because it's actually relating on back to itself somehow. You see what I'm trying to say?
Sort of.
Maybe I'm saying nothing. Maybe actually this is the negative unity, perhaps. I don't know. Should we go to that second paragraph?
But see, this is a paragraph that's had me confused because it seems like the first sentence is saying the opposite of the last sentence. But I'll read it. In the relation between the two, the relation is the third term as a negative unity. And what I've started to do in this paragraph is, instead of every time he uses the word relation, it gets confusing. So I've swapped the word relation for synthesis to sort of show it as this third term, which is the unity of the two, of the dualism. So I started using the word synthesis instead of relation. Maybe that'll clear things up. In the relation between the two, the relation is the third term as a negative unity, and the two relate themselves to the synthesis, and in the synthesis to the relation. Such a relation is that between soul and body, when a man is regarded as a soul. On the contrary, the synthesis relates itself to its own self. The relation, maybe I should say the synthesis, is then the positive third term, and this is the self.
Yeah, so that's what I said before. If the relation relates itself back to itself, that's the positive third.
Okay, but as I read the first sentence, in the relation between the two, the relation is the third term as a negative unity, and the two relate themselves to that synthesis. So, what the heck is a negative unity?
Yeah.
Maybe what he means is the two things contradict each other, but they're still coming together. So it's sort of this paradoxical unity, and it's negative in the sense that it shouldn't be.
Well, you could say, like, for example, this is a silly example on my part, but it jumps in my mind. A fire hydrant and a dog, neither are human, so they're in that sense united, because they're both not human. They belong in the same set of the non-human. Because when he talks about the human, he's speaking of it definitionally, I would say. So how do you define something? You define something by what it isn't, right? Like you say, a human is a rational animal, which means a human is an animal, but he's also rational. So he's both, which means he's not simply one or the other. So a soul and a, what does he say? Soul and
body and soul.
Yeah. So we obviously have bodies. I think we have souls, and maybe that's a definition of a human. But the human is the third term in that definition. See what I'm saying? But like the Trinity, if the human's here, soul's here, body's here, what's the relation between the soul and human? What's the relation between the body and human? Notice I could just make another triangle with an idea relating body and human, and a different one relating body or soul and human. And so where does it stop? Right?
Oh, it's just
he's bringing it back, saying the relation relates to itself. I don't know how to picture that, but it seems to be how he's trying to get out of
the
that
relation
expansion.
What do you mean?
Which again is the third man problem in Plato.
For synthesis.
What?
You said the relation relates itself to itself. I always took that to mean the relation is another word for synthesis. The synthesis relates itself to itself. So it's talking about the dualism. That's how I've pictured it. It's the relation, which is this positive, this negative unity third term. And it relates itself, which is the necessity, and then the freedom. So right, that's how I interpreted that.
Maybe in like another way we could say it too is, let's say Robert and I are having a conversation and we can't agree on it, on what we're talking about, maybe on the terms or on the argument and what the argument implies and all that stuff. We just can't agree. You step in as a third man and decide between us. You adjudicate. You decide who's right? Which
okay.
You make the synthesis happen. But
these examples are tricky because I would find it much more helpful if you use something like heaven and earth, or maybe eternity and time, or finite and infinite, or maybe even something like God and man. You have anything, Robert?
So my book has a footnote, and it sends me to a quote from Upbuilding Discourses, so his sermons, basically. And in order to explain what this self is, the first self is the relation between the two. The relation to the third is a negative unity. We already said that.
Mm-hmm.
But the quote is that when a person turns and faces himself, and in order to understand himself, he steps, as it were, in the way of that first self, halts that which was turned outward in hankering for and seeking after the surrounding world that is its object, and summons it back from the external. In order to prompt the first self to this withdrawal, the deeper self lets the surrounding world remain what it is, remain dubious. This is indeed the way it is. The world around us is inconstant and can be changed into the opposite at any moment, and there is not one person who can force this change by his own might or by the conjuration of his wish. The deeper self now shapes the deceitful flexibility of the surrounding world in such a way that it is no longer attractive to the first self.
This is even more confusing than the first paragraph.
Yeah, except that he's being sort of more straightforward. He's talking explicitly of a first and second, or a first and deeper self. So the first self seems to be more superficial, like kind of like what I was saying about the merman or Don Quixote or whoever else, right? As this aesthetic hedonist, they're in a pretty straightforward relationship with the world, right? And then the deeper self casts the outer world into doubt. I don't know if that helps us, but Um,
I like that because that idea of casting it into doubt or putting the future in jeopardy brings me back to what you had said earlier, Robert, about shock being a way to awaken
yeah,
one out of their prior stage, whether it be from the aesthetic to the ethical, or not heaven forbid, God have mercy, the ethical to the religious.
yeah,
Like Don Quixote, his aesthetic is all the books of chivalry in his library. The ethical is, I'm going to commit to the lady in my mind or out there in a village who is the one I profess and make my oaths to and become a knight on behalf of.
yeah.
But it's weird because it's not like she knows who it is. Like, it's kind of that voyeur.
I said Don Quixote. I meant Don Giovanni, which is entirely different.
Yeah, indeed. Very different.
But yeah, Don Quixote is more of a naive good person. You know, someone that's well intentioned. Don Giovanni is a bastard, more or less. He's a you know, a philanderer.
Do you think Don Giovanni makes all three moves, or is he stuck in one of the modes?
Which three moves?
The aesthetic, ethical, the religious.
Oh, I think he basically just makes the aesthetic move. He gets dragged off to hell in the end of the opera because he doesn't get out, right? He can't get out of the same mode that he's always been in, as far as I remember anyways.
I can relate to that personally. Like, if I would have, when I was young, like, I had a certain way of reading the Bible, and I thought about Jesus a certain way, and I probably could have stayed in that mode. Like, I thought of Jesus as a storyteller. The character in the Bible was like a metaphor for living a good life, being honest.
Good.
But I personally made a move to, he's like fully God, fully man, object of worship, and give your life over to. That was definitely a switch. So when you talk about staying in frame the entire life, eventually he was cast out and punished, Don Giovanni. So I can't help but apply that theologically in a weird way.
Yeah. I have sort of the reverse of that, not quite to the same extreme, where it's like, you know, a much narrower focus on the surface reading of the text and sort of reading it in a very modernist way. And now I've sort of shifted to where I'm much more interested in something like biblical theology, or I'm much more interested in, you know, what the historical authors meant, and that's just opened a whole new world for me. So if you take something like, you know, Genesis, like the modernist straightforward reading is, you know, this is a scientific text describing how the world came into existence. But if you look at the Hebrew context, it's much more, okay, you know, we have this 7-day structure and this cosmic temple view, and this filling and forming, and all of these kinds of things just open themselves up if you look at it through the lenses of the original author. So that's sort of a shift I've made, which is in a different direction. So yeah, but to get back to the text, I guess what I get out of this paragraph fundamentally is the synthesis is what relates the self to itself. That's good.
Yeah.
Do we?
I guess that makes sense, kind of. Sort of.
I mean, could this be the egg of psychology? Like, is this? I don't know where Freud is in the timeline of this book being published and read considerably, but is this idea of tension and negative unity, and they're not quite synthesized yet, but give it time? I mean, is that amenable to your you're conscious, but you're really unconscious. And where the unconscious is, the basement, that's where all the action happens, because that's where your drives are, the urges, the stuff that knocks up from beneath the floorboards like a beating, ticking heart saying, you're actually Cain. You've committed murders of sin, so to speak. And then that shocks you. Or is this not to be read like a psychological, proto-psychological text?
Definitely, I think. Yeah.
Because Kierkegaard is definitely different things to different people, but like everybody wants to claim him. Like the philosophers, except the philosophers don't want him. I remember in college, everyone, like philosophers telling me, Matthew, you cannot, this was in a secular school and like things like that. And they would tell me, Matt, you can't just study Kierkegaard. You have to broaden out to the whole of continental philosophy. But like psychologists are like, yeah, Kierkegaard he was really onto something. I don't know about theologians. I mean, Robert, how really?
I'm not a theologian, but my degree is philosophy.
How do they receive him? Yeah.
Actually, fairly well.
Okay.
There aren't that many people that read him. Well, they don't know who he is. I mean, he's a Christian philosopher. That's pretty much it.
The people.
But my supervisor knows him and he likes him. And he's not a Christian, but he knows that he's insanely brilliant. Like he's got a staggering intellect.
Yeah.
Like, how can you write like that? How can you write in 10 different voices and be convincingly different every time? You know, write whole books.
Yeah. I mean, we are vaguely aware of the possibility of a different perspective, but to put on that different perspective as a personality and then to write an entire book is just whoa. But yeah, I think the people who have read Kirkegaard are just, you know, if you think theologically, a couple names come to mind of people who've read Kierkegaard, and they bring a whole new perspective that's much more interesting. You know, if you think of someone like Karl Barth or Paul Tillich or you know, Stanley Hauerwas, who I'm a big fan of, has read Kierkegaard, so he has his footprints everywhere.
Yep. On the note of whether or not it's a good whether it should be read as psychology, I think it's better psychology than Freud, probably better than Jung. It's because, so to me, Freud's problem is that he noticed that there's something wrong with a society when they repress everything, and he wasn't wrong. That's obviously, there's something wrong there. So his Victorian society that he lived in, they were quite repressed. But then he made a mistake of assuming that, on the one hand, that was typical of human beings, and on the other, that all the good stuff was happening under the surface, and you would only know what a human being is if you could really study, you know, the unconscious. Kierkegaard seems to get that the good stuff is higher up. It's higher up. Like,
yeah, good point.
It's like, it's not the worst a human being can be, you know, the depths of their unconscious. It's the best they could ever possibly be, their relation to God. And that's something that Freud would just dismiss outright because that's religious nonsense, more or less. And Jung would only entertain as, in a very, you know, mystical way, as he does, right? You know, he talks about it as God as something like, often he talks about it as something like, that could be equated to the collective unconscious or something like that, right? Not a very personal God. But again, sum up, just basically Freud thinks that what's important was the terrible things that man is capable of, and that he is closer to the animals than he would like to believe. And Kierkegaard would say almost the exact opposite, I would say. Maybe.
Could he say the last?
We were closer to the angels than we dare to risk.
Oh, yeah. what are you saying? Sort of, Freud thinks all the interesting stuff is in the basement, and Kierkegaard says all the interesting stuff is outside the front door.
Yeah, or in the attic. Like, the metaphor of the house, is it in this one? Is the house metaphor in Sickness? Or is it in a different one? Let me just, I think it might be in here.
I don't remember the house metaphor. Never come across it. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Interesting way of seeing things.
Anyways, he has a metaphor of a house, and he basically, oh, here it is. It's on page, for me it's on page 43, but I think I've got a different translation than both of you.
Yeah, I've got something.
I'll look at this section. Hold on.
Oh my.
This is a section called Despair as Defined by Consciousness. It's section B.
Okay.
Of, let's see.
Got it.
Section.
Consciousness of being in despair also is, as also it is conscious of being a self, when there is, after all, something eternal.
So yeah, so if you skip ahead through that next paragraph, he says, imagine a house with a basement. First floor and second floor plans that there is or is supposed to be a social distinction between the occupants according to floor. Now, if what it means to be a human being is compared with such a house, then all too regrettably, the sad and ludicrous truth about the majority of people is that in their own house they prefer to live in the basement. Every human being is a psychical, physical synthesis intended to be spirit. This is the building, but he prefers to live in the basement, that is, in the sensate categories. Moreover, he not only prefers to live in the basement, no, he loves it so much that he is indignant if anyone suggests that he move to the superb upper floor that stands vacant and at his disposal, for he is, after all, living in his own house. That's the house metaphor. So basically, Freud says the basement is where it's at. The basement is who human beings really are. And Kirkegaard says, actually, there's like 3 more floors up there. You should come out.
Do you think, maybe but it didn't sound to me like what the basement was is analogous to Freud. Speaking of the unconscious, it seemed more like the automatic aesthetic person we were talking about earlier, more something like that.
Yeah. My point would be simply that kind of person is driven by something like what Freud was describing as being, I guess, the id, right? Like the sort of physical urges, procreate, eat, etc. Those kinds of things. Physical drives. That's kind of the way I read it, anyways. Because Don Giovanni's driven by one thing, right? That's sex, and other figures have other things that they're driven by. But if you're driven by one thing like that, that is a physical thing. That puts you, firmly in the basement. Also firmly in Freud's category of the id as well. So
here's an interesting connection. So have you ever watched the 4-part documentary? This is on Freud, called "The Century of the Self"?
I don't think so.
You would find this very interesting. So what they get in there is how corporations in America basically picked up on Freud's ideas and then used them to basically start put advertising on the next level, and basically propagandize and control people into consumers. And it's fascinating to think of this, what you just said about the basement, and also Kierkegaard's notion of the crowd, where what's happening there is you're sort of controlling the desires of a mass of people and sort of making them do things they're not aware of. They're following their desires, but they think they're being expressive individuals. So a few more things. Later in the film, it gets into the hippie movement, and I just found this absolutely fascinating. So what ended up happening to the hippie movement is the marketing, the people in marketing discovered that these were people who are interested in radical self-expression. And then they started targeting that. And the next thing you have is the hippies all turn into mass consumers. And another example of this is what goes on in social media, where you sort of curate this identity, and then you'll sort of select the best parts of you and then put them online. So you have this sort of fake identity. And then something even worse happens is people start liking or retweeting or whatever your posts. And then this creates the selection effect where you're actually curating your profile according to what others think. So while you think you're being radically self-expressive, you're actually just falling into the crowd in a weird way. So the crowd is sort of selecting for these everyone sort of turns into cool sheep in a sense, where they sort of just do what's cool and think they're being self-expressive. So yeah, I think that connects.
Yeah, definitely.
I think too on that, like certain evangelical practices. Now, I'm not calling out a crowd of evangelicals or anything like that, but certain practices of attempting to convert, I put in scare quotes, others. So for example, when I was growing up in high school and I was just entering the Christian faith, a few people would give me videos, and these were videos of apologetics. And they weren't apologetics for me, they were quick zingers and one-liners that I was to repeat to others because they would work.
Yeah.
They would work. And when you were talking about the construction of the consumer, I think those videos, and I won't name them, but basically, hey, are you a sinner? You don't think you are, but you really are. And then a quick proof text in the Bible, and then this anecdote, and then catching them in a corner with words. They'll admit to some kind of unconscious sin that nobody can disavow. And then you've got them. Then you got them. Then you just bring in the solution to their problem, and that product is the Christian message of the gospel. So it's interesting how that may be argued to have been adapted from what you were outlining.
Yeah, here's another example. This whole notion of having a reason for what you believe, and this gets co-opted into having a slogan for every objection anyone can have. And I've sort of experienced this where, you'll try to open up a discussion on something, and then somebody will have watched too much apologetics, and he'll just have this, you sort of see the person's eyes glaze over, and he'll just recite this thing. And that's the discussion at the end of it, because he has the answer and he's got the package, and here you go.
His job is to sell you on the package. And its merit. So and then it's weird, because in a Kierkegaardian sense, you think you've went from the aesthetic, I do what I want to do, to the ethical, because you bought the product that is the Christian message, or whatever religious message you happen to be associated with, compartmentalized into, and then you rationalize your practice by looking towards the religious category and saying, I'm doing it for God.
Yeah.
And so you're not in the religious category authentically, but you think you are.
Yeah. You're not taking the movement of faith, and I think this is where this notion of the moment comes in. This moment when somebody starts a conversation with you, you have the option of just throwing out this regurgitated package deal, here you go, eat this, or you can open yourself up and be vulnerable and say, this is actually something I struggle with myself, and let's try to work this through. Let's have a genuine conversation. Let's speak heart to heart. Let's not do this autonomous zombie thing where we just recite things to each other, right? That's I think what Kirkegaard calls us to always, is get out of your comfort zone and get into that moment stage, that place where real life happens, that upper attic room. Get out of the basement. That's what he's always calling us to, I think.
Yeah. To put it in the Kierkegaardian word of our paragraphs, when we're doing it wrong, we think we have the synthesis and you don't. So let me give you the synthesis if you borrow my words and repeat after me. But instead, like what I heard from you was, together we're making this synthesis. Like maybe today you're focusing on the infinite and maybe I'm focusing on the finite. If we're being honest, we can find that, oh, I'm actually talking past your infinite with my finite. So let me borrow your infinite for a while so we can actually, and then maybe you'll reciprocate and then we'll both be helped. Or, you know, fill in the blanks. It's Mad Lib. Absolutely. I want to talk about sin. You want to talk about culture. Hey, we don't have to merge them, but we can be honest and like borrow from each other.
Yeah. I want to let Robert get in on this, but
yeah, that makes pretty good sense. I want to go back to the paragraph we were reading.
Perfect.
It's interesting that you have soul, Julian, because I have. I'll just read you the sentence that I have.
What do you have?
In the relation between two, the relation is a third of negative unity, and the two relate to the relation, and in the relation to the relation. Thus, under the qualification of the psychical, the relation between the psychical and the physical is a relation. Actually, mine's more confusing, to be honest. And mine's supposed to be a really good translation, too, so. I don't know why it's written that way. I like yours more.
Soul and body. Well, you'd have to get into a discussion of what soul means. But I do think the translator is reading something into the text that's not necessarily there.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if anticlimacus would want to jump right to soul right away, but he does want to talk about.
He gets into God at like paragraph 4, so.
Yeah, that is true, but I think maybe psychical is better, even though my paragraph is still more confusing than yours.
I suspect
psychical might be better because it's less. It's less big of an idea. It's got less baggage. Maybe not. I don't know.
But I would guess in Kierkegaard's time, the word soul would be relatively uncontroversial.
Perhaps, yeah.
Maybe people would know what it means.
Well, actually, Hegel used it too, right? I think Hegel probably used exactly the same word, but he was talking about something else. Of course, it wasn't really the same. Just like when he talked about God, he wasn't talking about the same thing either. He's talking about some other kind of God that isn't God at all.
Sorry, were you talking about Hegel?
Yeah, Hegel. Hegel's God is not Kierkegaard's God, of course.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's right.
It's interesting to see these two thinkers, Hegel and Kierkegaard, or maybe just Hegel and Nietzsche, as these people on the wall looking out to what is on this side of church history. So we had the resurrection, early church, middle church, schism, Protestant schism from the Catholic side, and then Luther in that second schism. And then these two thinkers, which in a lot of circles you get indirect reference to Kierkegaard and direct reference to Nietzsche. I find that interesting.
Yeah, you wouldn't have. Obviously, this goes without saying, I guess. But Nietzsche's only the kind of thinker that Nietzsche was is only possible after the Reformation, after the schism, after the Protestant schism, I guess you could call it, right? Because he is a he is he's better than how do you say this? He's more Sam Harris than Sam Harris will ever be. Nietzsche is. He's a better thinker. He takes scientism, I guess you could call it, more seriously. He takes it to its nihilistic end, more or less, and then he tries to save it by giving an ontology of what a human being is. But it doesn't really work, in my opinion. But that's another story, I guess.
I thought
I was gonna do my research paper on Nietzsche, but I decided to do Kirkegaard at the last minute. So.
Good choice.
Robert, let me ask you: Do you think Kierkegaard? I don't want to make it an either or, but do you think Kierkegaard, if you had to put it this way, do you see him as a restorer of what he sees as primordial Christianity or the native strain throughout, and he's trying to just restore and repair post Luther and all that? Or is he trying to be radical and innovative because the times call for that push towards the future?
The first one, I think.
Me too.
So he talks about this himself a lot, and if you read any of the biographies, they'll probably mention this. But the state of the Danish Church was something like the state of the United Church of Canada was or has been for a long time. It's just kind of whatever. I shouldn't use the United Church of Canada because it's not quite right. The Danish Church was Lutheran, as far as I can tell, and because they have saved by faith, right? You're saved by your accepting the grace of God. They cheapened it, so you get Bonhoeffer's cheap grace. You get easy salvation, right? Everyone's just assuming that they're part of the church, and then they're gonna they'll be fine. It's whatever. They're not really sinning. I mean, they once in a while they do. It's not a big deal, right? It doesn't really matter. You go to church on Sunday. You do what you got to do. And then Kirkegaard comes along and he says, that's not Christianity. That's just a little bit of moralism. It's a little bit of moral posturing, right? And he decides he's going to make, explicitly he says this, he wants to make Christianity hard again.
Yeah.
So and I don't think it's a trick. I don't think it's just a gimmick. I think he actually is trying and fairly successfully at getting at what it is to be a Christian. The problem is that for a lot of his writing, the perspective he takes on it is from the outside, and because faith is a relationship of trust and not something you can have
syllogism for.
Yeah, you can have straightforward knowledge of it. It's not part of the same category.
That's the thing. It's this debate between the atheists and the Christians. It just fundamentally misses the point.
Yep.
From a Kierkegaardian perspective and from my perspective, because it just, you can have that debate all day long, and you're not going to get to the essential issue. And that's what I think that's what Kirkegaard was sort of getting at in his critique of Christendom. Though I would say, when I think of Christendom, I often think of something like, maybe America in the 50s, where you have this civil religion that's tied up with the nation state, and being a good American means being a good Christian and paying your taxes and voting and these and going to war and these types of things. So that's what I think of. Right. And also this patriotism and pride in your country is also tied up with it, where Kierkegaard was also reacting to this Hegelian notion that Denmark